Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast edition. And thank you for listening.
Spring has come to the Great Plains. You have your tomato seeds already started indoors.
Tell them about the coffee cups. Tell them about the coffee cups.
We're doing gear. There will be Thomas Jefferson Hour merch. And so there will be a coffee cup. What does it say? Good day, my dear citizen.
Rock and roll bands. They don't make any money on the tour, but they make it on merch.
Yeah, well, we'll see about that.
This is all in good humor, and we may make a little bit off of it.
You do know about the time I went to the International Hemp Fest.
Yeah.
And Janie and the shirts that said, "Have another brownie, Mr. Madison." Yeah, that didn't work out.
Yeah.
That one didn't
There's still boxes of those.
There are in my garage. There's a ton of them. But
don't joke, because people will want them.
So this woman comes up. She's dressed in this kind of hemp halter top. She's like 24. There's
love this story.
There's 60,000 people at the Hemp Fest. The tertiary smoke would be enough to choke a horse. And so we're there. We're selling this merchandise, and I have to give this talk. So afterwards, I'm there in street clothes, and this woman comes up, and she's just as high as a kite. And she looks and she sees these. This was back in the cassette tape era, and she sees this cassette, and it says, "A Conversation with Thomas Jefferson." And she looks at that for the longest time and looks around, looks back, and she said, "How did you do that? He's dead. How did you?" So, and really, it's a very good question.
Well, not to get too far.
It's actually the best question.
Yes, but not to get too far sidetracked, because we could talk about. Well, I want to stop this right now so we don't get a bunch of questions. Jefferson grew hemp, as did many of the founding fathers.
But he did not ingest it.
Yes.
Although I was told by the leader of the Hemp Fest that he grew good bud and smoked it too. And I found that a little harder.
Well, then.
And I said, "What's your proof?" And he said, "Well, if you grew it, wouldn't, So that was one of the great moments of my career. But we talk about plants and the miracle of the mustard seed.
Yeah, I got a little bit kind of
a little weepy. We got a little. We got verklempt.
Yeah, but I do. What I meant to say, in a shorter way, is that people who are living in cities, and we know this because we say, last year we had Craig LaHoulier on, and he's got this strain of seeds that they're like heirlooms, but they'll grow in pots, and it was like, and you said, grow anything, grow a tomato, and then we get mail from people who get.
And they love it.
And they go, I understand now. It's like, it's part of being human that we've lost.
Russ,
some of
Russ
us.
Eagle.
Yeah.
So about 3 yeyears ago, I gave him a pea.
Oh, yeah, you do the pea experiment.
This is the Robinson Crusoe pea thing. So I gave him this pea.
What's he up to?
Well, this tells you all about it. So I gave him this pea, and I said, your job now is to proliferate peas, as if this were the last pea on earth. So he took it back to North Carolina, where he lives, and he grew it, and he got a number of peas. And he saved them, didn't eat a single one. And then the next year he planted them again, but now he got flooded out. So he only got like 3 peas. So it's not like that thing where you put 1 grain of...
Not like in the book.
Yeah. So and now this year he's growing them again, but there's a struggle because you could get wiped out. Once he gets a bushel of peas, end of story. It'll always have abundance, but this is a great part of this story because he's a type A guy. He does not neglect his pea patch, but nature has made it difficult for him to proliferate this pea. No fault of his own. So you think, well, wow, that's amazing, because today we take this for granted. Nobody thinks, what if there are no more corn seeds? Nobody thinks, what if there are no more bean seeds? That problem is solved. Humans will always have seeds. But back then, if you're Robinson Crusoe on the island, you've got like 2 grains of oats. That's it. And so this is the miracle of it, that you could start with 1 seed, and in 5 years you could have a warehouse under the right circumstances. But that fragility where you're just climbing out of the starvation towards abundance, that's the critical moment. And that's why this is, if you've seen The Martian, where he grows potatoes.
I think that's part of the real attraction of that movie.
Right. It's like, are you going to beat starvation by finding a way? And then he has this profound setback where his crop is destroyed.
Yeah.
This is really important.
I remember that book came out and on a show. This was years ago. and we were talking about, what did you read? And I said, well, I got this quirky little sci-fi fiction thing, and I don't really read it. And it's called The Martian. You said, I've read that. I picked it up in an airport. It's great. And then we found out it was going to be a movie.
And the film
anyway,
was good.
It was.
The sequel is not as good. He wrote a sequel. It's about a woman on the moon.
Artemis something.
Right. It's not as good, but
it's good.
But it's the same thing. It's like the Apollo 13 story, which is what's the window, what's the gap between you and death? And in Apollo 13, they had to cobble together all these filters and so on because they'd lost so much of their service module. In this case, like Lewis and Clark were never faced with starvation, but the Donner Party was, and it wound up, as you know, in the case of the Robinson Crusoe story,
one bad turn.
Defoe makes it work. But you know what Robinson Crusoe does? The minute he gets a crop, he separates the seeds and puts them in 3 or 4 locations so that if somebody stumbled on his crop or if there were a washout from a rainstorm, he would have backup. So my hope is that I don't mean any disrespect, Russ. My hope is that within my lifetime, you can send me a quart of seeds when they are out of trouble, when they have reached their takeoff point.
We're going to go to the show. It's mostly questions answered. We have questions from, I will tell you, Stephen Krieg about John Wesley Powell, Kerry Krutowski about David Thompson,
The Explorer,
Joshua Soderlund about American Serengeti. That was a fun one.
The Daniel Flores interview, which you can find on jeffersonhour.com.
Judith Rice-Jones about rice.
About upland rice stolen from Italy.
Right, and Chad Gangwer, and that was about educating young people.
Don't you need to do your...
Do I?
I think.
Oh, no.
If you like this show...
Yeah, you got it.
I got it. We hate to say this.
Get real close to your microphone and talk in a whisper voice.
We hate to bring this up because we do this out of love of humanity.
Oh, good.
To ameliorate the condition of mankind. But the fact is...
I'm never doing it again.
The fact is that it takes real money to make this program work. And we don't do it for profit. We're not dining out
you were
night
born
after
for
night.
this.
But we could use your help. And if you like what we're doing, if you believe that America needs a new enlightenment,
keep it down.
If you
close
love
on the mic,
Mr. Jefferson and all that he can represent for the future of human happiness and liberty, then please help us by leaving us your mansion in the Bahamas or your private jet or a fleet of ukuleles or whatever it might be, or just cold, hard cash. But we would appreciate any contributions you can make.
I think your mic is fading.
To the success of this.
Can't quite hear you anymore.
But if you can help us, my dream,
your
if
point
I had
is
one,
made,
is that we would like to be on a household name and be on 500 stations, and you can help us get there.
Okay, it was funny for a couple minutes.
I'm not being funny. I'm being serious. You can help us, and so please
dial the number you see below.
Order now, and you get 2 copies of our special
Thanks very much,
sermons
everyone.
on the New Testament.
Let's go to the show, may we?
Yeah, you see, we'll get a ranch.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the man who portrays President Jefferson when he's here, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And I must say, Mr. Clay Jenkinson recently returned from an epic trip to the East Coast.
I was gone so long from the Great Plains of North Dakota. When I left, the snow was 4 feet deep.
I was going to say you actually warmed up, right?
And when I came back, the snow was gone.
It just about is.
There's just a little bit in my garden still. I think it's going to be a great year for gardens. But when I left, it was still essentially the last gasp of winter. And when I returned, it was definitely spring. Cool, windy, and melting.
Every year is a great year for gardens.
So Jefferson said.
Sometimes the
now
weather doesn't
you have started
cooperate.
your tomatoes.
Oh yeah, I got little seedlings going, and I've cut back this year, trying to be a little more
modest.
Yeah, and specific about what I grow, but then the list comes in, and friends volunteer to share seeds, and I don't know how well my modest garden is going to do this year. There's so much I want to grow.
I was in the Outer Banks, so I flew to Norfolk.
Big official trip.
This is a residency.
Yeah.
For the Bryan art series in the Outer Banks, And so I loved it. I was there for 5 days.
You've been there before and talked about this great restaurant.
Well, it's called Coastal Provisions, and it's owned and managed by my friend Daniel Lewis. So, among other things, I did a Jefferson performance.
Of course.
I did a Meriwether Lewis performance.
Which is one you do not as often.
But I can do that in my sleep. Those two
characters ingrained.
I've got those. And Lewis, in some ways, is the one that's deepest in me. Then I did Walter Raleigh, which I worked so hard at. And then it comes and goes in an hour and a half, But Walter Raleigh, who was one of Jefferson's heroes, the man who named Virginia, although he never stepped foot in North America, Raleigh, who was on death row between 1603 and 1616 because of the suspicion of James I that he somehow was not truly a partisan and a patriot.
That reminds me, too, of a great show you did with your lovely daughter.
With Catherine, yes.
Yes, and, which if people are members of the 1776 Club, they can find in our archives. But he's really a fascinating character. You and I have talked about him, and, for the fact that he was on death row for how many? Almost
10 years.
Like a decade, right.
And while on death row in the Tower of London, he wrote this massive folio volume of almost 900 folio pages, so huge, like a big dictionary, called The History of the World.
Right.
And I actually went with my friend Russ Eagle. You've heard of him.
Yeah.
The man, in the book.
Yep. Won't bring that up.
We went over to the Outer Banks History
Thanks,
Center.
Russ.
And we were able to hold in our hands and to turn the pages of a first edition of The History of the World. They have one. Weighs 7 or 8 pounds. Magnificent. And I took some photographs of key passages for my daughter because she's going next year to Oxford.
Right, yeah.
She went to St. Andrews in Scotland, did her MLit there, and wrote a little bit about Raleigh. Now she's going to Oxford to work with the great Stephen Gunn at Merton College, and she is going to write about prison literature by men on death row in the Tower of London in the early 17th century. And one of her big people will be Sir Walter Raleigh, who wrote this book. He had a library of almost 500 volumes on death row. That doesn't happen today.
It was a great episode, and I'm gonna make sure that we post the name of that show on the website. It's jeffersonhour.com. If you are a member, if you support the show and you're a member of the 1776 Club, you have access to
unlimited access,
hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of shows. So
then,
that's a really good show.
The last thing I did there was my Shakespeare program. So I do this one-man Shakespeare program. I don't pretend to be Shakespeare, but
and you have some very special help.
I recite passages, and I talk about how the film adaptations today are so magnificent that we're living in the best time ever to make sense of Shakespeare. Because when you see Shakespeare on a stage and the actors are 100 feet away from you, and you're not really ready for the bombarding of Elizabethan English, it can sometimes sort of cloud your brain. But when you see Al Pacino in The Merchant of Venice, or you see Kenneth Branagh in Much Ado or Henry V, when you see these unbelievably good film adaptations of our time, it gets in more immediately and more fully than it could on a proscenium arch stage. And so I'm telling people...
I've told you about the first really professional Shakespeare that I went and saw, which King Lear,
right,
at the Guthrie Theater
in Minneapolis
in the 70s, the original Guthrie Theater, and
which was much better than the subsequent Guthrie Theater.
I wouldn't make a judgment on that.
I would.
But you would, okay. But it was something I was not prepared for. I will say that.
And what happened?
Oh, I was just overwhelmed.
It overwhelms you.
Yeah.
That's why these film versions are better, because you can actually. It's like people that
you can't do Shakespeare in one sitting, I guess is what I came away with.
You can't do it cold.
So how do these people in the theaters during Shakespeare's time, I mean...
Well, that was their English.
Yeah, but they probably absorbed, 10-20% of it, or who knows?
I don't know. What do we absorb from a contemporary play by Noel Coward or somebody? That's a hard question.
Right, I'm getting you off track. I'm sorry.
But anyway, I do this thing, and I show people that it's not as hard as you think. And the resources that we have now, the websites and the film adaptations, and this set of books called No Fear Shakespeare, which has the original text on the left and a paraphrase on the right, that these resources make this the best time ever in the history of the world, including Shakespeare's time, to understand Shakespeare because of the resources that we now have. And so that's the purpose. But my friend, Paul Lassico, who gave me this opportunity at the Roper Theater in Norfolk a year and a half ago, he came. And we did this scene from Act 5 of Hamlet, my favorite piece of literature, the graveyard scene where Hamlet comes back and he encounters this witty and rude gravedigger, and they have this exchange of wit and wordplay, and the gravedigger out-Hamlets Hamlet in being clever, and Hamlet's like totally impressed, like, this guy rocks, he out-Hamlets me. But then Hamlet discovers the gravedigger's throwing these skulls out of this grave, and the gravedigger says to Hamlet, whose skull do you think this is? And Hamlet's like, what, I'm supposed to know? How would I know? And then he says, oh, it's Yorick's skull. And Yorick was the court jester. And so then Hamlet, this is the ultimate moment of existential absurdity. The court jester is now a skull, and Hamlet encounters him. Hamlet knew him when he was a child. And then there's this famous speech, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, a fellow of infinite jest, and so on. One of the greatest speeches in all of literature, not just all of Shakespeare. So Paul and I did the scene twice, once for school and once for the adults. There's a special set he had made where he has this trunk that opens into the grave, and he has these skulls and a cross, and he dresses up like this country bumpkin gravedigger. It was so much fun. And afterwards, there was a school counselor there named Wayne, who's also on the board of this cultural series that I was in. And he said, this should be in schools everywhere because, you're talking about death. Is there a God? What happens when we die? Hamlet's concern is his mother has remarried and he can't stand his stepfather. He's still grieving his father's death. It's about revenge. What happens when somebody upsets you so deeply that you really need to strike back, but you shouldn't? And he said, these are the questions that adolescents everywhere need to be talking about. And we don't have any mechanisms in our culture anymore to have these conversations because that's not what churches really do anymore. Church attendance is down among the young. And also schools are afraid of ethics and afraid of these conversations. He said, if you did this program for an hour and then took a break and then had sessions where counselors would be there and say, let's talk about step-parents, let's talk about divorce, let's talk about when you realize your parents
so you think
have a sexual life.
So you think it would be a vehicle for...
He thought so, and I think so too. And, and working with Paul was such a satisfaction. This was my first love, as you know, the Renaissance. I did my my work at Oxford on Renaissance English, and then John Donne, the great poet, preacher of the early 17th century, who, by the way, knew Shakespeare and knew Raleigh, and they knew him. It was just such a joy, and something that Paul said. Paul is a theater manager, but also an actor, a real actor, and he said, just being on a stage and being able to voice language that beautifully modulated by Shakespeare is an honor and a privilege. That really struck me that he's been at it for 40 years. He said, just to be able to voice Shakespeare with his perfect cadences, I dare do all that does become a man, who dares do more is none. I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. The rhythm, the pace, the language, Shakespeare's capacity to bring you in and grab you and then lift you. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties and form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Paul was saying, that's just a human joy of almost unbelievable potency. And so this was just great. So I got to do Raleigh, swashbuckling Raleigh on death row, writing the history of the world, and having sent the mission to Roanoke, the Lost Colony mission in 1587. Friend to Queen Elizabeth, one of her favorites, can't get along with James I. That week was so wonderful And Pat Brodowski.
And exhausting.
And Pat
right?
Brodowski was there.
Oh, great.
Our friend the gardener. She came to the dinner.
We need to call her.
And she was in great form. She brought tobacco so I could use it in the Raleigh program. She made a pipe for Raleigh to pretend to smoke. She bought some of the vegetables for the dinner at Coastal Provisions, which is the place operated by my friend Daniel Lewis. We sold out for that. It was a wonderful, exhausting week. I like this idea that I'm somehow able to do a lot of different things in short order. I reached tilt by the time it was over, and I just wanted Orville and Wilbur Wright, who did their first flight there, to fly me right back to North Dakota.
Oh, that's right.
I went to the Kitty Hawk site. Amazing site.
We're going to take some time this week and answer some mail. As you can tell from the music, it's about time for us to take a break. But there's one other character that has popped up in your repertoire, and that would be
John Wesley Powell.
So I have a question pertaining to him that we'll get to after.
We'll start with
after we take this break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about, well, many other things at times. And this is one of those at times, don't you think?
We've gotten a lot of listener mail. We've been talking about my recent residency on the Outer Banks. I hope to go back year after year. And then one of the characters they want me to bring, well, two, J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Of course.
Who is in some ways my favorite character, the father of the atomic bomb, and the explorer and Civil War hero, John Wesley Powell.
And let me interject that you're going to be performing as Mr. Powell in Vail in June 17th this year.
Vail, Colorado, one of the most beautiful ski resorts in the world. Yes, June 17th, 2019 at the Vail Symposium. And let me tell you what else about this. John Wesley Powell was this one-armed Civil War veteran. He lost his right arm at Shiloh. He went on to explore the Green and the Colorado rivers. He wrote a famous book about that in 1875, and then in 1878 he wrote the Arid Lands Report, which was a blueprint to revolutionize the way we develop the lands beyond the 100th meridian. By the way, the barn, the New Enlightenment Radio Network barn, is on the 100th meridian. It's on the line of demarcation for Powell.
As long as it doesn't get too wet. It's sliding,
yeah. Well, we need some funds to shore it up.
We'll talk about
It's on the 100th meridian. And he said that's the line of demarcation east of the 100th meridian, which runs from Bismarck to Pierce, South Dakota to North Platte, Nebraska, and so on. It's wet enough, gets enough rain to grow regular old crops. But west of the 100th meridian, it's too dry for that, and you're probably going to need irrigation, and therefore you'd better develop your land law and your water law accordingly. So he's a very, very important figure, and there are Powell events going on around the country.
This is like you set up the perfect segue to get into our listener mail that we're going to answer this week. The very first question is from a Stephen Krieg, and it's actually for Mr. Jefferson. Can you swap into that somehow, or
I can
answer on his behalf?
I will answer on his behalf.
And he writes, your system of linear land demarcation has been quite valuable.
That's the townships and square miles and so on.
Yes, and he's asking Mr. Jefferson, as a retired forester, I spent many a day finding survey marks in our western forests based on township, range, section, and subsection. This would please Mr. Jefferson.
Dates to 1784. Jefferson proposed the rectangular survey cadastral grid system, which has governed the entire continent.
Stephen Krieg goes on, I also admire how John Wesley Powell advocated for a land management system based on the boundaries of watersheds. Simply put, the ridge lines below which water flows into a common stream or river network. So much more sensical than drawing state boundaries, which, as your hosts have noted, shift with the floods.
Well, what Powell advocated was replacing the rectangular grid system.
Jefferson, he's lost already.
Jefferson's not going to like that.
No.
And Powell wanted a watershed system, so that he called them watershed commonwealths. So instead of having the upper Colorado and the lower Colorado, which has led to decades of conflict and litigation, why not have a watershed commonwealth that embraces the entire ecosystem? And then resource questions about diversion of water and irrigation and water storage and the health of the forests and municipal use would be adjusted for that entire commonwealth rather than by disputed sovereignties of Arizona versus California or the lower basin versus the upper basin. And so he wanted to jettison the grid work of the of the rectangular survey grid and create a long lot, sensuous, watershed-based system in which no acre of the American West would ever be deeded out to, no parcel would ever be deeded out to a homesteader unless there were water rights and water resources in that deed. So you couldn't, here's what happened. So someone gets a homestead in Nevada and there's no water and it never rains. Well, you're not going to make it. And so Powell wanted to make sure you can't get a homestead unless there's water attached to it somehow.
And so we can pretty safely say that Jefferson would not like this at all. He would have to see the logic in it, though.
He would, and Jefferson believed the earth belongs to the living, of course, and he believed that science will teach us how to live. And so he would say, all right, if it doesn't, he didn't know that it didn't rain in Utah. He didn't know that it doesn't rain much in eastern Montana. So he would have said, of course you make necessary adjustments according to the actual the health of nature with a capital N.
At the end of the letter, I think he's sort of trying to make up with Mr. Jefferson by saying, letting him know that he is a seed saver from last year's harvest. So,
well, that's good. No, I think Jefferson. So Powell was a Jeffersonian. He grew up in the middle border in the kind of Indiana, Illinois, Ohio country. Although he was born in New York, and he was a Jeffersonian. He wanted
both planters, both students of the land, right?
Wanted people to be able to thrive as family farmers. But he said, why would your government allow you to file on a homestead that would necessitate and guarantee failure? We can't allow that. And so we have to change the way we deed out, the way we distribute lands beyond the 100th meridian, or we're creating just an endless tissue of failure and frustration. And he was right. He couldn't have been more right.
Got another one, Carrie Krukowski. She writes, I just watched a documentary, Uncharted Territory, David Thompson on the Columbia Plateau. Have you talked about the map that he made that Jefferson signed? I'm not sure that we talked about that one specifically, but Thompson's a hero to me.
Me too.
And you've been to the monument.
David Thompson Memorial in North Dakota.
I actually have photos of that.
You've been there.
One out. Oh, yeah, man.
Yeah,
Several times.
Just to tell people who post a photo on the website. So it's in the middle of nowhere near the Souris River in central North Dakota. And if you asked 600,000 North Dakotans, who's David Thompson and where's his memorial, they'd say, who did he play for? Yeah. But he was a great explorer, greater than Lewis and Clark in many respects.
Great journals that he left.
Tremendous journals.
Well, just wonderful reads.
And he was one of the best at latitude and longitude ever, better than Lewis. And he was in North Dakota. He was at the Mandan and Hidatsa villages. And so there's a monument to him.
But what about this map that she is asking about that Jefferson signed?
Well, Jefferson was collecting all these things, so he had a copy of it. I've never seen it, but
it exists.
This connects them. And you know who we need to get on this program to talk about this? Nicandri.
Oh, sure.
Nicandri loves David Thompson. He knows a lot about it. We'll
Among
find the map.
other things.
He's our Enlightenment guy.
Yeah, he is.
He hasn't been on this program for a while.
Quite a while.
We're going to have him on soon.
Well, he was working on a book
on Captain James Cook, which has been accepted for publication.
Oh, excellent! Then
and a second book.
More reason to have him
recent
on.
essays he's written about Lewis and Clark has been accepted for publication by Washington State University Press.
Doesn't surprise me.
He's riding high.
Yeah,
we'll get him on to talk about this. I have not seen the documentary Uncharted Territory, David Thompson on the Columbia Plateau, but I will watch it this week.
I've got to watch for that too.
And the map, I know that Jefferson had the map, but I did not know that he had signed it.
Have another question here from Joshua Soderlund. He listens on KVPR 89.3 FM in Fresno.
And I need to go back there to do a fundraiser.
Fresno, I know you do.
The Central Valley, Visalia, Fresno, Bakersfield.
He writes, I am reading American Serengeti by Dan Flores, which was recommended on a past episode. I believe that was your work, sir. Could Thomas Jefferson talk about Philip Nolan and the wild horses of the American West?
First, let me say that Dan Flores is an extraordinary man, a genius, and his book, American Serengeti, is about the Great Plains of America and the Intermountain West before the Europeanization of the continent. And he says it was a true Serengeti with bison and grizzly bears and bighorn sheep and mountain goats and wolves and mule deer and pronghorn antelope and prairie dogs and coyotes and so on, and that was all this kind of steady state Serengeti that native peoples were living in with great success and harmony. And then, of course, we came along and we have utterly changed that world. And so he's trying to recreate what it must have been like when Lewis and Clark were there. And so I interviewed him, and you can see the interview on the Jefferson Hour site or on my own site, clayjenkinson.com. It was one of the best interviews I've ever had the chance to do, David. And I asked him, let's say you're in a hot air balloon and you're dropped into Montana in June of 1805. What do you see? Look around. And he described what he saw, and it just made you ache. It just made you ache. You know, you've seen some of the larger bison herds on the reservations and so on, and when you see them, you just think, what must it have looked like when there were millions of these creatures and everything that attended them, from coyotes to grizzly bears? It must have been something, so they can find that. Now, as to his question, Philip Nolan and the wild horses, Jefferson knew this. So Philip Nolan is
tell us who Philip Nolan is, right?
He's the man without a country. So he wound up in the famous short story, The Man Without a Country.
And I have this book. It was a book my father gave me, this bound edition. It's a wonderful,
And so he was a horse collector, and so there were Mustangs all over Texas. So the Spanish had come, and the horses got away, and they proliferated in the American West. Indians took to them the way we took to Chevrolets when they were invented in the early 20th century. Just like overnight, Native people said, hey, the horse is something we want. So these cultures transformed themselves from pedestrian cultures into equine cultures within a decade.
Yeah.
And the Lakota were one of the great beneficiaries of the coming of the horse. At any rate, there were all these wild horses, these Mustangs, floating around the American West, and Philip Nolan would go in raids into what's now Texas and bring back a herd of 50 or a herd of 100. He was violating Spanish territorial law, but he brought them back. And eventually he died in one of those excursions. But Jefferson wrote to his friend William Dunbar in Natchez and said, I've heard of this guy. Yeah, it sounds what he's doing. He said, we need to get detailed descriptions of these Mustangs while we can, because he said eventually we'll settle all that land, and this historic moment where there are new wild horses in North America will be lost and lost forever. And so Jefferson was aware of this and, saddened to hear that Philip Nolan had miscarried. But Nolan was basically a poacher, violating the boundaries of Spanish North America to bring back illicit horses to sell on the markets in Natchez and New Orleans.
Here's another one from Judith Rice Jones, KRCC is where she listens. Were there any grains grown at Monticello? If not, from where were they acquired? Did Jefferson exchange grain seeds with friends in Europe? She references the story about rice from Italy, and that's the only seed story she knows.
Yes, Jefferson grew wheat. He grew oats, he grew barley, he grew the grains that existed, plus corn, if you call that a grain.
These were generally on fields away when you read about it, we think of Monticello as this big farm and garden, but it was sort of segmented. There were different areas.
He had many farms in the area, and then he had some farms way off at Bedford where Poplar Forest was. So he had a number of plantations, let's say, and each plantation was divided into a group of farms. So and Jefferson was basically self-sufficient. So he was growing all the grains, and he and his son-in-law, Thomas Mann Randolph, were very much interested in crop rotation systems to heal the land and prevent the kind of deterioration that comes from monoculture of tobacco. And so Jefferson was trying to replace tobacco with wheat for two reasons. One is that tobacco is so labor-intensive, slavery, and that Jefferson said, and it doesn't feed anyone. It doesn't produce a nutrient. It produces a noxious weed.
Yeah, you often portray Jefferson as really anti-tobacco
but
on
he
the
was
show,
stuck
and
with it.
That's accurate.
But he was stuck with it, and so he keeps going back to it because it's the cash crop.
So he was sort of a slave to it, even knowing that his land was being destroyed by its growth.
He hated the idea of tobacco because he thought the whole moral philosophy of the agrarian for Jefferson is that you produce food. That, we used to have this bumper sticker here in North Dakota, farming is everybody's bread and butter. And we'd have bumper stickers that say one farmer feeds 100 people or whatever. That's Jefferson, that the farmer does this beautiful, virtuous, life-affirming thing by growing food.
May I interject? Just a little garden thing. I mean,
yes, sir. Not
to break your train of thought, but you talk often about that miracle.
It makes me cry.
And you talk about our friend Selkirk and the
and Robinson Crusoe, the oat seed.
Yeah. And this time of year, especially for those of us in North Dakota, we like to see the spring as quickly as we can, so we begin growing seeds inside. And there is just something primeval when you take these lettuce seeds that are like the size of a pinhead, and they begin to grow and turn into these luscious green plants. There's something in my head that's that far back human that just kind of snaps at that. I guess that's why I always, and you do too, encourage people to grow a tomato in a pot. I mean, there's just something that happens to you that we've lost track of. So
I think you nailed it. So I think it's deeply embedded into our hearts and souls. It's one of our oldest memories, that seeds.
Yeah.
And you've seen this. So my favorite biblical parable of all of the pastoral parables in the New Testament is the parable of the mustard seed. And Jesus says, this tiny little mustard seed, it's like the size of a pencil tip. You put it in the ground and this giant bush grows. He said, that's grace. That's what God's grace is that it can grow out of the tiniest little seed base of your own faith or your own devotion. I just love that. And another part that makes me always just astonished, David, is when you plant a bean seed and it's in the ground for 4 or 5 days, and then it pries open the earth. It literally, this thing is this. It's like a shield on top of it. Yeah. It's like the size of a foot, and it pries open the earth. And then when it opens, it elongates and rises to the sky. And that's where we get the fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk, that a bean grows like a bean. It grows that wildly.
That shape is kind of like a foot.
It is. It's a shield, and the fact that it can break through the crust of the earth and then grow against gravity straight into the air. I mean, you feel the miracle. Jefferson wouldn't use that term, but you feel the wonderment of nature at its finest. And so seed growing, my grandparents were dairy farmers. That's almost the number one autobiographical detail that I ever say to anybody, because that's the thing that connects me to Jefferson and the agrarian, but I also think that it's a deep, deep, deep cultural memory of the miracle of the seed. And in Robinson Crusoe, he dumps out this little bag, a couple little grain seeds in it that he doesn't even notice, and suddenly they start to grow, and he realizes, if I can keep these growing, my food problems are over. And within a couple of years, he has grain storage facilities all over the island because the miracle of the fecundity of seeds. That's what led to Jefferson belonging to the physiocrats. So certainly all of that is true. So he grew grains, but he could never fully wean his economics from tobacco. And when he had to go back to tobacco, it always really upset him, because you can't eat tobacco, and we now know that tobacco is toxic, but also it's intensive labor. You need field laborers. It's like growing in the lettuce fields in California. You need what we used to call stoop labor, and the form of human labor that was available in Jefferson's world was African-American slavery. And so he realized every time you put a tobacco seed in the ground, you're just voting one more time to keep the slavery system going. But he thought with wheat, we know wheat is not a labor-intensive crop. Certainly not now with mechanized agriculture.
Not now it isn't, but back
even
then
it was much less than tobacco.
Before we take our break, maybe you can quickly address her question about him, seeds from Italy.
So
it's a great story you've told before.
I love this story. He found this upland strain of rice in Italy, and he wanted to bring it back to the United States because he thought so much better than flood rice. But it was an illegal thing. It was a capital offense to carry it out of Italy. It was a state secret, industrial monopoly. And so Jefferson put a handful in his pocket, and he also paid a muleteer, a farrier, a teamster, to carry a couple of bags of it over the Alps on his behalf, and he brought it back, and with great fanfare introduced it to the Carolinas and said, here, this would be a superior form of rice. And Pat Brodowski was telling me that they have recently found some of that rice growing, I think, in Florida. We'll find out from her.
Well, we do need to talk to her. There's a whole list of things we could talk to her about, but
she's probably busy actually being a farmer.
That's right. But again, this question came from Judith Rice Jones.
Rice, no wonder.
Well,
thank goodness her name wasn't tobacco.
Went right over my head.
Right there.
But he did break the law, and
he broke the law, and it was a capital offense. He could have gone to the.
Things could have been much different. Anyway, we do need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. When we return, we'll answer more questions. If you'd like to ask President Jefferson a question or have a comment on the show, go go to jeffersonhour.com. Click on Ask President Jefferson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Sitting across from me, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
And we've had a good batch of questions this week to answer. You know, we're so far behind on
There's
all
a stack
this.
of them here. We need to keep going.
In the past few weeks, we've had a number of authors on. We had Peter Stark and young Washington.
That was a really interesting interview about a book about Washington before he became Washington.
And then last week we had Stephen Fried and his book about Benjamin Rush.
Yes, he has a wonderful new biography of what he calls one of the founders who needs to be found.
And I bring this up because we have another Jefferson Hour book club coming up. It's Notes on the State of Virginia, what many consider Jefferson's only real book.
This will be in early May when we do the book club on Notes on the State of Virginia. And I'm told by our producer that if people are going to send in thoughts, questions, or comments, it should be by 4/29. That would be the end of April.
We'll look forward to that.
I still am hoping for Tacitus down the line. I know you've rejected Tacitus.
Well, that's not exactly.
You just find him a little heavy sledding.
That says something about me, I guess, which I will accept. But, there's so much to read about Roman history, beginning with Gibbons, really.
Edward Gibbons' Decline and Fall
and there's
of the Roman
Herodotus,
Empire.
which I should be reading, and Tacitus, which
Polybius and Livy and
it's just
Sallust and Suetonius.
I need to retire
Horace
so I can do nothing but read.
By the way, it was Lisa Silverman of the Community Libraries of Los Angeles who suggested the interview with Mr. Stephen Fried. So
Further
thank you.
proof that we read all of our email.
My point is that so many new books are being published that we want to take a look at that
We'll
we could do
continue.
nothing but interviews with authors. But this one with Stephen Fried was particularly interesting, as was the Peter Stark discussion of young Washington.
Another question. This is from Chad Gangwer. It's a question that we get a lot in different ways. People write in and say, well, Clay, do you have a list of recommended reading about Thomas Jefferson? And people can find that on the website at jeffersonhour.com.
But if people want just two titles, let me start with Joseph Ellis, American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson. Quirky, but as usual, amazing. American Sphinx by Joseph Ellis. And then my favorite of favorites, Merrill Peterson's one-volume Oxford University biography of Jefferson called Thomas Jefferson and the New Nation by Merrill Peterson. But they're both high on the list. If you go to the website, jeffersonhour.com, we recommend books that people might wish to read. I also am, as you know, leading this cultural retreat in January on Charles Dickens, and so now I have to read Dickens every single day to get ready.
Oh, poor you! I bet you it's just they have to. Someone needs to tie you down.
I have 4 complete editions of the works of Dickens in my living room, and
only 4.
well, I would do more if people would just give me more. But it's
But one of those collections is really special to you, with the onion skin and all that.
Oh yeah, the 1923 Indian skin edition. Yeah.
Indian skin. Excuse me.
And they're just the problem with it is when you have these magnificent complete editions of someone like Dickens or Dostoevsky or Twain, is that you don't want to use them. So then you have to buy trade paperbacks because you don't want to be spilling coffee or dog-earing pages in the onion skin edition. You don't want to take that to the beach at Cabo. And so and then I have to buy trade editions too or read them online. But I'm reading Dickens. There are 4 of them that we're doing for this thing. The Pickwick Papers, which in some ways is my favorite. David Copperfield, which is in some ways my favorite. Great Expectations, ditto. And then Bleak House, which is the most critically acclaimed of his books. But, if I were on a desert island and I had to choose,
I wouldn't make you do that.
complete works of Dickens could keep me happy for the rest of my life.
Really?
That's no
Just like
question.
Chad Gangwer wrote and wanted to know, his letter is, I currently act as an educator and curriculum designer in Virginia, and wanted to know what readings, ideas, and or suggestions Jefferson would have had for educating young people in their formative years. And I know you have an answer for this because we've talked about it.
Well, it's going to sound pretty nerdy and oppressive. What Jefferson would say, you got to learn your Latin and you got to learn your Greek and you got to read French.
I was thinking of the reading lists. That
But
it's so much fun to,
you have to read those books in their original languages. So he said when you're young, you should study languages and mathematics because your judgment is weak, but your brain is as strong as it's ever going to be for acquisition, memorization, hard rote work. So you should force young people to do the really tough work that involves ratiocination, the workings of your brain and memory. It's called ratiocination.
I do not know this word.
That's like deep reasoning, methodical deep reasoning. And then when you get older, your brain is less sharp, and that's when your judgment has caught up with you. Now you actually know something about life. Then you should read the great classics because now you bring a more mature soul, a more mature brain to that process.
I'm still thinking about that, the sharp and soft edges. There's a great, if I might.
Yes, please.
There's a great story that I always used to use in the days when I was a recording engineer, and it was analog tape, which is nothing more than iron dust on plastic,
right? Sort
of on there, and magnetic waves change the shape of it. And so you'd come in with a fresh roll of tape and you'd record, and then the next day you'd come and listen to it, and it was a little softer.
Drops a little.
So,
and then a year from now,
it goes a little. Well, what it is, it's like if you go out and you make the most perfect sandcastle with knives and shovels in the evening, and it's absolutely still, and there's no wind, and you get up the next morning and it's still absolutely still. All those edges have softened. So, is that what you're saying is happening to my brain?
I'm afraid that it's like when you come back to the castle in the sand a week later, it's just a little lump.
Uh-huh.
That's what happens to our brains.
Well, back to Chad Gangwork. Sorry for taking you off that.
Okay, so books to read. So you want to read through English literature. So he loved Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. He loved, in Spanish, but in English translation, Don Quixote. He loved Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. So he would have thought these were relatively simple and straightforward books of fiction that everyone should read. Then you read your poetry by Alexander Pope and John Dryden, who were much more important then than they are now. This is pre-romantic. You read your Shakespeare and your Chaucer and your John Donne and your Milton's Paradise Lost.
But this could be a long list, but to summarize, what you're saying is...
Read every day, all day.
And do your hard studying first.
Force your children to learn to play the violin and to learn their French before you let them have any fun with Harry Potter. It's that simple for Jefferson.
Well, with that, sir, we're just about out of time this week. I know you do have some cultural tours coming up, and I'm supposed to remind everybody to go to jeffersonhour.com to support the show.
A few places in France.
Find out about your cultural tours.
So France in October, there are a few, this summer only, places on the Monticello trip. Monticello has sort of purchased the whole annual Lewis and Clark trip, but they called me and said, if there were some true friends of Monticello and Jefferson that I could invite a few people to come, so that's possible. Then the winter retreats are on Charles Dickens' 4 novels and the space program. And I've begun reading for this. I'm a space junkie. I think you were too. I can't get enough of Steinbeck.
And you're going to be in Illinois
years.
too.
And I'm going
June, right? June 17th, I think.
No, that's Vail.
Oh, excuse me.
That's the John Wesley Powell thing at the Vail for the Vail Symposium. But I'm going in May back to Chicago. WGN, my friend John Williams. We do this stage show, and it's just pure joy.
And with that, sir, it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thank you, David. A Jefferson Hour listener wrote me a snarky letter last week after Attorney General William Barr released a 4-page summary of the Mueller report, apparently clearing President Trump and his closest aides of colluding with the Russians in the 2016 election. After informing me that I had been embarrassing myself with what he called my anti-Trump rhetoric, the writer asked me if I were going to apologize for presuming that President Trump was guilty of crimes that would force us into a whopping impeachment ordeal. So here goes. I confess that I did in fact think that more indictments were coming, perhaps even within the Trump family, and I did think that Special Prosecutor Mueller would conclude that the Trump Organization conspired with the Russians to influence the election. I was plainly wrong. I'm surprised by the findings as outlined in Burr's summary, but I'm actually glad I was wrong. For the past year I have been living in real dread, wake up in the middle of the night dread, that we were descending into a prolonged and crippling constitutional crisis that would paralyze America without ever resolving anything. I knew that if Mueller concluded that the Trump administration was guilty, Trump partisans would reject the prosecutor's findings and declare without evidence that this was proof positive that the deep state was trying to remove a legitimately elected president by coup d'etat. Personally, I believe Mueller stopped short even on the question of obstruction because he cares about America and its central national institutions more than he cares about the shenanigans of this particular president. I believe he took the long view and crafted his report with profound strategic precision to buttress due process, the rule of law, and the sanctity of the FBI, the Justice Department, and the courts. We haven't seen the Mueller report yet. I expect that it will simultaneously confirm everyone's worst fears and yet in a technical legal sense exonerate the president. It will simultaneously please and displease everyone. Trump's defenders will celebrate its decision not to indict, but they will be outraged that so many unsavory details of the president's behavior will be exhibited for all the world to see. Watch. They will demand that the FBI's internal report on Hillary Clinton now be released to the public too. Meanwhile, those who would like to see the president impeached will find plenty of evidence to confirm their views that he is palpably unfit for office, but they will be deeply disappointed that Mueller did not thrust in the legal stiletto. Everyone will declare victory, everyone will feel some defeat, and after all of that, we will bumble along in the usual deeply divided and angry manner of the last dozen years. It seems to me now that we are really two countries. About 35% of America is scathingly anti-Obama, anti-Hillary, anti-Pelosi, anti-political correctness, anti-liberal. It's not clear what percentage of that population admires Donald Trump with the kind of Fifth Avenue fervor he prefers, but the fact that he is not Hillary and not Obama seems to be enough. About 50% of the country is passionately anti-Trump. They would love to see him escorted from office in shackles. These two Americas do not like or trust each other. They do not debate fiercely by day and then drink scotch together after hours. Even worse, these two American tribes, the Reds and the Blues, literally do not understand each other. Each side believes that it has a monopoly on virtue and truth, and each camp believes the other is openly betraying the ideals of America. The liberal progressive believe they are America, and the conservatives are a bunch of superannuated extras that somehow crept out of a time capsule of Ozzie and Harriet or Leave It to Beaver. The conservatives believe they are America, their anthem was written by Lee Greenwood, and that the liberals are nothing but crypto-socialists who want to give the wealth of America to a bunch of brown people who want to shame us for what our great-great-great-grandparents may or may not have done in the conquest of the continent. These tribes do not, as Jefferson put it, disagree as rational friends who all want what's best for this country. They hate and loathe each other and accuse each other of treason. The gulf is wide and widening, and I do in fact believe that we will see armed outbursts in what the great Watergate journalist Carl Bernstein has called our cold civil war. In other words, with or without the special prosecutor, we are in a serious constitutional crisis. I don't know whether President Trump will finish out his term, but I reckon he will. As I have said on this program previously, since World War II, we have essentially evolved into a quasi-monarchy, and whether we like to admit it or not, our presidents now really are above the law. I don't know what you would have to do to be impeached in this our happy republic now, but the experiences of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush in the Iran-Contra affair, Bill Clinton in the bedroom, and G.W. Bush in fudging the weak evidence of weapons of mass destruction to engage in a $4 trillion preventative war in Iraq suggest that nothing can ever trip the impeachment and conviction wire in a nation whose people, I won't say citizens, pay so little attention to the sanctity of the Constitution and who practice such severe and unthinking partisanship that at least 1/3 of whichever party happens to be in power would always vote to protect its president no matter how severely he violated the separation of powers doctrine, due process, the Emoluments Clause, or the War Powers Act. Here's the sad and dangerous paradox. If nothing constitutes an impeachable offense, future presidents, knowing that, will feel free to break the law and violate the Constitution in all sorts of ways because they will be rightly confident that they will not be held to account. Where there is no likelihood of punishment, there can be no restraint on the misuse of power. As someone who has recently delivered a lecture on Julius Caesar and studied classical history in college, I can affirm that this is the spiraling path of the Roman Empire. So I don't quite know what to say to my snarky friend who asked me to apologize for misunderstanding Donald Trump's innocence. I do know this. I know Thomas Jefferson about as well as I know anything. It's impossible for me to believe that the most elegant, modest, power-averse, egoless, and civil president in our history could find anything to admire in the current occupant of that office. Raise your hand if you disagree. Jefferson would not support President Trump's admiration for such autocrats as Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin. Jefferson's contempt for even the milder tyrants George III and Napoleon Bonaparte was severe and unending. Jefferson would not support President Trump's ad hominem attacks on his rivals, fellow heads of state, allies, Gold Star families, hurricane victims, residents of what he called the S-hole countries of Africa, and women whose looks he chooses not to admire. And though Jefferson sometimes complained about the press, he would certainly not approve of President Trump's repeated denunciations of the mainstream press, some of whom he has called enemies of the people. In fact, I have no difficulty concluding that Donald Trump is the least Jeffersonian president in my lifetime, which spans every president since Dwight Eisenhower. The most Jeffersonian presidents of my time have been John F. Kennedy, Jimmy Carter, and to a certain degree Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump is at the far other end of that spectrum. Jefferson didn't like Patrick Henry, who was a junior league demagogue, or Andrew Jackson, who found his way up into the majors. Jefferson believed the president must carry himself with dignity, responsibility, modesty, respectfulness, and endless decorum. Jefferson also believed in legislative supremacy. His mission statement for the executive branch was, "A few plain duties performed by a few honest men." So that is my answer to my email antagonists. You may call me one of the deplorables, but I am absolutely certain you cannot make the case that the third president would find much to admire in the 45th. Nevertheless, our Constitution is robust, and we are a strong, resilient, and robust people. We will assuredly get through this. And I, for one, am looking forward to reading the Mueller report. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.